MOBAs are a very intense and overwhelming genre of games to get into, but there's a perfect champ for any fresh-faced, starry-eyed newbies trying out League for the first time. Yuumi, the cat with a magic book. That's her title, I think. She can attach to her allies using her W ability, so she doesn't even need to worry about following her team at the right moment or making any big calls. She can just coast around on the shoulders of her allies. From there, she can shield them with her E, heal them with her ult or passive, and slow enemies by using her Q. But Yuumi has very little health and mobility, so catching her alone often results in her immediate death. But despite how simple she is, Yuumi is by far one of the most hated champion designs in the entire game's history, with people often affectionately referring to her as the Parasite Champion, all due to one key part of her kit I have yet to mention. When she's attached to an ally, she's completely invincible. I'll be honest, I've never had much of an issue with Yuumi personally, but I can still admit that her design has quite a few issues with it that can make her incredibly annoying, not just to play against, but even to play as. So I wanted to take a stab at a few miscellaneous concepts on how to change up Yuumi's gameplay to make her feel more enjoyable. But first, we gotta start by figuring out what her exact problems actually are. The big problem is her invincibility while attached to an ally, and more specifically the fact that Yuumi is an enchanter. The main goal of enchanters is to buff or protect allies, and debuff or crowd control enemies from the sideline while their team does all the damage. But their biggest weakness is that they can't really protect themselves should an enemy choose to target them. So the classic way to deal with enchanters is to target them first. The problem with Yuumi is that you can't do that. You have to kill the person she's protecting to even have a chance to hit Yuumi, and that's only if she doesn't sneak away to another ally before you can get her. The other big issue is fighting an enemy with Yuumi attached to them doesn't feel like fighting two enemies. It feels like a 1v1 where the opponent just happens to have a massive buff. This, even if subconsciously, makes fighting Yuumi feel worse because you won't mentally equate that champ with Yuumi on them to the equivalent of two separate champions. And even if you do know that Yuumi's there, you can't do anything about it, she's invincible. League made some recent adjustments to Yuumi in an attempt to fix how she feels, but I really dislike how the new passive turned out. Her passive used to give you a shield and mana when you auto-attack while not attached to someone. Now it gives you a heal, but the heal can be applied even when already attached. On top of that, you now get a ton of bonuses for sticking on one ally long enough to form a best friend bond with them. So yeah, there's even less of a reason for Yuumi to ever detach from their ally. To me, the cool part of Yuumi was jumping all around your team, helping everyone you can, and that's even what we want her to do because the time where she's in between allies is actually a vulnerability where she can be damaged or stunned. Another thing that made her feel more fun before was that her old ultimate used to root enemies in place. Now it just heals allies, which feels far less impactful. Which is actually the last big issue with Yuumi. Yuumi's old root on her ult could make a huge difference in a fight, but now all she can do is heal a bit and shield a bit. Her impact is almost imperceptible. You just have to attach yourself to somebody who is already strong and hopefully they win, but it's hard to really feel like you were the reason they even won. Having said all that, I think the real main issue people have with Yuumi is her personality, which I can't really fix, but let's at least try to address her gameplay problems. Removing the invincibility from Yuumi when she's attached to allies is the first change people think of when considering ways to fix this cat's playstyle. The most frustrating part of fighting Yuumi is that you have to kill her last in any fight, so she gets to apply all of her value for the entire duration of the fight, which means making her actually able to be damaged seems like an obvious step, but how exactly do we go about doing that? If we just literally remove her invulnerability, then she'd always die near instantly. Yuumi would have very little agency over her own health bar. It'd be up to her ally to dodge attacks for her, and if she's on a tank or a diver or anyone who'd bring her right into the middle of the fight, she's gone. You could try to buff up her durability to make her able to survive enough to deal with that, but then she'd be incredibly hard to punish if she's attached to a marksman in the back of the fight. So for the sake of balance, she'd have to be completely useless on any allies in your front line. Now, Yuumi being encouraged to stick on the marksman in the back seems pretty good, since that's where she should be supporting regardless, but I think you should allow enchanters to be helpful to their team even if their laning partner falls behind. With this, Yuumi would be stuck supporting the same one person the whole game, even if they're struggling so much that it'd be better for Yuumi to help someone else. And I already said that I dislike how the best friend part of her current passive encourages her to only stick to one teammate, so this, being essentially the same thing, just might not work. A possible solution is to make it so that Yuumi has a circle around her attached ally that she can move around. This could actually be a pretty cool concept, since it'd allow Yuumi to have more agency in dodging attacks, or she could intentionally body block attacks that were going to hit her ally. You could see Tank Yuumi circling around her squishy ADC, blocking all the skill shots that come their way. But it just wouldn't be Yuumi anymore, would it? It's way too different of a gameplay style. So overall, just making Yuumi targetable is probably not a great idea. Well, what if instead we kept her untargetable, but made her take a portion of the damage her ally took? Obviously, she'd need to be made tankier again, but just expect that she'd need some durability buffs with pretty much all of these ideas. This could either be done by making Yuumi just take some bonus damage on top of what her ally took, or by making her mitigate some of the damage her ally would have taken. This would actually synchronize quite well with her shield to prevent her ally from getting hurt, and her heal that heals both her and her ally to undo any damage they'd both take. However, there's a couple issues. If Yuumi's ally takes 100% of the damage still, then she'd be less fun to play since single target abilities would now be stronger against someone with Yuumi on them because they basically deal 125% of their damage. But if Yuumi reduces her ally's damage to 75, then she'd be less fun to play against, since it'd make the ally she's attached to arbitrarily tankier than normal just for having a Yuumi on them. I think either way would still probably be better overall than what we currently have, because you'd at least have some way to deal with Yuumi first by just targeting whoever she jumps on. Even if she jumps from full health teammate to full health teammate, she's still taking damage. But the Yuumi can use that to her advantage by constantly shifting the enemy team's aggression between her allies so that no one takes too much damage at once, and that would give the Yuumi player a better goal and a more clear impact, especially if she reduces the damage of the ally she's attached to. So this one isn't a horrible option, all things considered. It'd push Yuumi into sticking to squishy backline allies, but not make it impossible for her to help the front line. It'd give a clear goal for players who want to take her out first, and it'd give the Yuumi player a more obvious impact in a fight. But just making Yuumi always vulnerable might be too much of a change from her current identity. I know classically League doesn't really care about removing the most iconic part of a champion most of the time, but I do. It's happened to me too much already. So what about some choices that keep her invulnerability but give players a means to counter it?
Stay positive?
Time to take matters into our own hands. If Yuumi's just gonna stick to one ally the whole time, then give the opponent a means of getting her off. The most common idea I see for this is that stunning the champ that Yuumi is attached to will remove her and probably put her jump on a short cooldown. Doing this would still focus Yuumi towards the backline since frontline champs soak up a ton of stuns during a fight, but it also wouldn't make it impossible for Yuumi to be helpful to everyone. This also means that the Yuumi player would have to be more proactive in moving from ally to ally, or could even jump off an ally right when they're about to get stunned and then jump back on, meaning they won't just get to sit around and do nothing without being punished. And I think that sounds great to most players, except for people who play Yuumi. Yuumi would become a lot more difficult to play because a point-blank stun on her ally would essentially spell death for her. In fact, this would mean that stuns have twice as much value as normal because the detached Yuumi is effectively as worthless as a fully stunned champ. So what if we made the requirement for removing Yuumi just dealing a lot of damage? Like, let's say you have to clear 30% of an attached ally's HP within half a second or something like that. So a big burst of damage will kick Yuumi off. This would again synergize well with her healing and shielding methods. The shield would prevent the damage threshold from being reached, and the heal could be used after Yuumi is kicked off to patch up some of the damage done. This would mean that the enemy would need to commit to a big attack to get her off her ally, so she'd be a lot more effective during small poke exchanges, but she'd be awful in the backline of a teamfight, since assassins can easily burst down a backline champ. But this means that Yuumi would probably stick on the tanks in the front. Tanks are not easy to do a burst of damage to, so Yuumi probably wouldn't get kicked off them as much as anyone in the backline, and unfortunately, people hate Yuumi the most when she's sticking on a tank or bruiser, making them even more unkillable than they already were, so not ideal. If I'm being honest, I'm not a fan of any of these options so far that punish Yuumi players just for having the gall to exist. I think the best way to deal with Yuumi's problems, for both playing against and playing as her, would be to—
A lot of good mages out there, are you not?
This last option is to give Yuumi more of a reason to be off of her allies and open up more of the vulnerabilities she already has. I feel like this is a better approach than giving her new vulnerabilities because that risks making her too weak or too different to be fun for people used to playing her now. Currently, Yuumi's passive is the only reason she'd ever want to be away from an ally. But the problem is, as I mentioned at the start, her new passive works off of her abilities too, so she doesn't even need to detach anymore. Technically, I could just say that they should revert her passive back completely, but I actually like that her passive, which makes her vulnerable to use, is the heal now, since heals are far more permanent and impactful than shields. So just remove the part where abilities can activate her heal. If you really want to reward Yuumi for landing her Q in lane, then just make it restore mana or something. So the only other vulnerability of Yuumi that we could expand is the brief period when she's jumping between allies. This is already an idea I'm most partial to because, as I mentioned at the start, I really like the gameplay of jumping from ally to ally in a teamfight, and I think that would be a much more interesting opponent to fight since it makes Yuumi vulnerable repeatedly for small amounts of time, rather than extremely vulnerable just one time. To do this, you should first make her jump a bit slower, so this weakness is more apparent. From there, we just need to give her a better reason to jump around a lot, so get rid of her dumb best friend bonus on her passive. That would already do wonders, but we could go even further by taking those best friend bonuses and letting her use them on any ally for only a short time. So all your abilities get those special bonuses on any teammate, but only for the first 3 or 4 seconds that you're attached to them. Obviously, you'd need some kind of cooldown for individual allies, so that the Yuumi doesn't just constantly hop off and on her ADC repeatedly, giving a bunch of bonuses indefinitely, but I think this is my favorite idea so far, and with some tweaking, could probably be a lot better than current Yuumi. Although this idea, like most of the options that have seemed the best so far, might be too far of a departure from how most people play Yuumi currently. The thing is, none of these are perfect solutions. Some of them seem perfect for Yuumi haters, but not for Yuumi players. Some of them seem perfect for Yuumi players, but not haters. And some of them only appeal to me and are too different from current Yuumi to really make sense. Like, I personally love the last idea of encouraging Yuumi to hop between her allies, but I also play a lot of ARAM where the entire team is around you all the time, so that type of gameplay might not be as fun in a normal game mode. I also love the idea of making Yuumi circle around her ally to block attacks for them, but that's a completely different champion idea at that point. I don't really like any of the ideas to remove her invulnerability because it just doesn't seem like it'd be that fun to play as, since you'd have very little control over your own health. But if they could figure out a way to fix the issue of Yuumi sticking to tanks easily, then having burst damage kick Yuumi off her ally seems like the best solution overall. But I will say definitively that I hate her best friend passive, and I think it was a horrible fix to her kit. It addressed none of the biggest issues with her and now encourages her to just sit on one person the whole game, which is less fun for her since it's way less interactive, less fun for her allies who will rarely ever get her help, and less fun for enemies since there's no reason for Yuumi to put herself at risk anymore. Oh, also, I think that if Yuumi was like a ghost or Darkin who possessed their allies to attach to them instead of a loud cat on a book, people would probably be a lot more forgiving to her.